Hi, I'm James.
And I'm Antony.
And this is Words and Numbers. From whatever far-flung location you are now.
I'm in Lexington, Virginia, visiting family.
I've met some of your family, because God knows there's probably thousands of you people roaming the earth, and some of the ones I've met have been quite lovely.
All of my siblings are professors.
Insert the sound of crickets chirping
pretty much. You can imagine the cocktail parties we don't get invited to.
I already know about the cocktail parties you don't get invited to, because they're at my house. Anyway, what's new and exciting in your world this week?
For several years, you and I have visited Mount Hebron High School in Maryland.
Love that place.
We lecture on economics and government to some of the finest high school students that we've ever met. The last time we were there and we recorded a live episode was in April of 2022. Last week, I got an email from their teacher, Van Prime, who told me that his students won again the National Economics Challenge. They defeated 6,500 of the best high school economics students in the country for the 7th year running. And then they turned around and defeated the top team from China, thereby making them the world high school economics champions. Mount Hebron is not a private school. It's not a charter school. It's a regular public school in a middle-class Maryland suburb. Yet year after year, Van Prime students beat students from the most elite and wealthy schools throughout the world. To those who say that the cure for our public school system is to spend more money or to spend less money or to have more programs or less programs or after-school stuff or before-school stuff, I point to Mount Hebron and say, no, what we need are more teachers like Van Prime.
You and I have been to probably, 200 high schools? I'm just guessing off the top of my head.
More than that.
We learned one very important thing pretty early on. Good teachers equal good students, no matter what.
Regardless of everything else.
Every other variable is pretty meaningless when you've got that one nailed down. And if you don't have that one nailed down, there's almost nothing you can do to make it better. There's your answer. You want to find and retain great teachers.
And I think people make the mistake of thinking, well, if you spend more money on teachers, you'll get better teachers. You'll get more expensive teachers, and you're certainly rewarding the good ones, but you're also rewarding the bad ones. The Anarchist Coffee Shop in Toronto opened in March of 2022. And I did not go through our past episodes, but I swear we talked about the Anarchist Coffee Shop when it first opened.
I'm pretty positive it was a Foolishness of the Week once upon a time.
It described itself as an anti-capitalist cafe. The owner hoped to encourage people to think critically about capitalism through his example of running a socialist cafe, I guess. Here's a quote from the owner. They're closing, by the way, that's the punchline. But the quote from the owner, unfortunately, the lack of generational wealth and seed capital from ethically bankrupt sources left me unable to weather the quiet winter season or to grow in ways needed to be sustainable in the longer term. He's blaming his shop closing on his inability to obtain what? Capital.
I'm guessing he doesn't take the lesson.
There's a magnificent lesson here, and I bet you're correct. It's gone completely over his head. But he goes on. I'd like to say a huge thank you to my landlords for their generosity and patience, and I'm kind of reading between the lines here that they let him float along for a while without making his rent. They could easily have sold this space or rented for more than twice they've charged me, so this place wouldn't have existed without them. Hang on, this last phrase, the place wouldn't have existed without them. Who are they? They're capitalists.
Capitalists, that's right.
My God. Well, the lesson that comes through here is socialism assumes that capital falls from the sky. And furthermore, I think socialists draw a false distinction between labor and capital. Capital is simply stored labor. You work, you earn money, you don't eat everything that you earn. What happens to the extra? Well, you save it. And what happens to your savings? It's invested. It becomes capital. Capital is simply stored labor.
That's just crazy talk. It's all about the oppression of the masses by a few at the top. You know, seeing as how we're on the topic, whoever signed us up for the Communist Party USA daily email, you can go because the joke's on you, buddy. I'm signing up for their programs, and I'm going to be the skunk in every Communist Party USA garden party. But I want to get us to something hopeful and optimistic before we get to the actual foolishness of the week, which is even more deplorable than the nonsense you just covered. I want to bring us over to Israel for a moment. And people generally don't realize how technologically advanced Israel is as a nation. They've developed a cancer treatment for multiple myeloma that has a 90% success rate.
90%.
You know, this kind of means something to us. Our friend Steve Horwitz died of blood cancer, and this is a treatment for that, and it's working. There are people lined up all over the place to try to get in on this, and I can understand why they would be. They say they have a waiting list now of more than 200 patients from Israel and other parts of the world at any given time. I often cover medical stuff for the thing that fascinates me every week. And the reason why is that we make such tremendous advances and everybody just kind of overlooks them.
We take them for granted. We complain about the high cost, but completely ignore the high benefits on the other side.
Let's maybe take a look at the miracle that's unfolding right in front of us, which of course brings us to the foolishness of the week. I only found out about it because a story came out roughly 3 hours ago. This story begins in 2009 in the great state of North Korea. You know, for all the socialists out there who want to live in a socialized paradise, go to North Korea. There is one U.S. military man who defected to North Korea.
Oh, really?
It has been done. Apparently, he's quite happy there. I don't understand that, but hey, each to his own. If socialism makes you happy, go there. Just be ready for a few things like no iPhones and bad internet, if any internet, and no food.
Yeah.
It's not that you can't open a coffee shop. It's that you can't get dinner. I digress. We want to go back to 2009 when a family was found in possession of a Bible and they were all imprisoned for life, including a 2-year-old child.
Oh my God, really?
These crackpots imprisoned a 2-year-old child for life in political prison because his parents had a Bible in the house. I'm not a religious person. I have no dog in this hunt, but this is positively ridiculous.
In the past, I've complained when people confuse dictatorships with socialism or communism. But you look at examples like this and you realize that if you're going to have a society that's going to make a serious run at making socialism work or communism work,
force is the only animal at the table.
Exactly. So you go back to the anarchist coffee shop. The coffee shop closes because he can't afford to keep it open. He doesn't have the capital. And so what would you do in a communist state? You turn to the state and say, well, force someone to give me a building, force someone to give me the equipment that I need. Once you open the door to that sort of thing, you can force people to do all manner of other things.
People in the West who are convinced that socialism is the right answer, what they really think is that they should be in charge. They're not workers, they're autocrats.
That explains in large part why you see such predominant support for those ideologies amongst intellectuals.
They know they'd be running the show.
Yeah.
And they, unlike the others who do it, they would get it all just right. But here's the thing. Tough guys always end up running the show. Intellectuals don't stand a chance when the tough guys show up.
For one-stop shopping for all things James and Ant, visit our website, wordsandnumbers.org. This week, Clark Neily joins us. Clark is Vice President of Criminal Justice at the Cato Institute. His areas of interest include constitutional law, overcriminalization, civil forfeiture, police accountability, and gun rights. Clark is author of Terms of Engagement, How Our Courts Should Enforce the Constitution's Promise of Limited Government. Clark, welcome back to Words and Numbers.
Great to be back. Thanks for having me.
Today, we want to talk about something that a lot of our listeners probably have never heard of, and yet something that is profoundly important. Can you tell the nice people what they need to know about the Chevron case?
Well, we got to start with the so-called administrative state, and this is the sum total of all those alphabet agencies that are scattered across the National Mall in Washington, D.C., which would include things like OSHA, the Occupational Safety and Health Agency, and the FCC, Federal Communications Commission, and so on and so forth. These executive branch agencies, these federal agencies, were created, at least in principle, to implement legislation that's passed by Congress. So Congress passes the Clean Air Act, which is in fact the federal law that was at issue in the Chevron case that we'll get to in a moment. Congress can't possibly speak to every situation that might come up when it passes a federal law that applies to the whole country. So what happens is you get one of these administrative agencies that has responsibility for implementing whatever statutes are within its domain, and they essentially sort of build out the details in terms of filling in gaps and speaking with greater precision to things that Congress spoke about more generally. The Chevron case, this is Chevron versus Natural Resources Defense Council, grew out of a question that immediately arises when you have agencies filling in gaps and deciding what the specific policy is going to be where the rubber hits the road. And that is, when somebody disagrees with the way that a federal agency has interpreted its authorizing statute, should the judiciary start fresh and look at that federal statute, that's the law that Congress passed, or should it defer to the agency's interpretation of the federal law in question? And the Chevron Doctrine, that's from the 1984 Chevron case, says if the statute is ambiguous, and by the way, narrator, most of them are going to be found to be ambiguous, then the courts should defer to the agency's interpretation. And this opens a giant can of worms that I just know we're about to explore.
So in other words, Congress says, for example, that the EPA should regulate navigable waters. The EPA comes along and says, here's a body of water. It's unclear what Congress meant by navigable. Therefore, we're going to go ahead, regulate this thing. And starting with Chevron, the Supreme Court says that sounds reasonable. So whatever you EPA say is the interpretation of the law. That's the interpretation of the law. Do I have that right?
Yeah, that's right. So a term like navigable waterway you might think is reasonably precise. It turns out not to be, at least according to the courts in implementation. So then courts will generally defer to the EPA's interpretation of that language. But it has to be a reasonable or a rational interpretation. And boy, howdy, do the courts reach inconsistent results on what it means to be reasonable or rational. And that's why we have a situation where a term like navigable waterways that, a simpleton like me or you or James might think you should actually be able to float a boat in that waterway ends up being applied to things like a transitory wetland, basically a big puddle that exists for part of the year and dries up the rest of the year. But the relevant federal agencies are going to say that that is a navigable waterway within their jurisdiction.
The court just says, okay?
No, the court doesn't say okay. The court says, oh, thank goodness we don't have to deal with this and interpret this law. Thank goodness for taking that off our plate.
This case was 84, correct?
Yes, Chevron versus NRDC, or otherwise known as NERDIC, 1984.
To be clear, prior to 1984, we were already in a regulatory morass. But this really took things and functionally told these alphabet soup agencies, you boys go nuts.
You've got a problem here that is really a thorny one, and that is if the Supreme Court allows Congress to get into way more things than the Constitution permits. I like to tell the story, by the way, of when I was a kid. I lived on a couple of acres of land outside of Massachusetts. On a kind of a wild hare, we decided to have a couple of goats one summer, and that was the way that I learned that if you allow a goat into the room where the goat food is, that goat will eat until it dies. Fortunately, we got to the goat before it did. But in our little story, the goat is Congress, and Congress will use absolutely every bit as much power as the Supreme Court says that it can have. So as you know very well, because we've talked about it before, during the so-called New Deal revolution of around 1937, the Supreme Court essentially said to Congress, look, we're not going to be in the business of enforcing constitutional limits on your enumerated powers, so you do whatever you want. Just throw the words Commerce Clause into the mix and we're going to say, fine. So now you've got 535 people who make up the Congress trying to regulate everything that happens, practically, spending whatever it is, $5-6 trillion a year now. I mean, you guys have already done this on the show. Look at the explosion in the number of pages that get printed in the Federal Register every year. So you've got, 535 not particularly, let's say, diligent people who are primarily focused on getting reelected, don't have a lot of time left over for governing, and they've created this giant, sprawling federal leviathan, and somebody has to run it. Well, guess who's going to run it? Federal agencies. Do you think the courts want to be involved in every single ticky-tacky dispute when some muggle like you or me disagrees with the wizards of the alphabet soup agencies telling us whether or not we can build our house here or there, whether it's okay to fill in that puddle on our farmland so that we can build a road into the back cornfield or whatever? No, the courts don't want to be involved in every dispute that comes up. How do you avoid that? You give the agencies deference, and that's what they've done.
But the Supreme Court is actually going to decide on a case that could upend all of this. What on earth is going on?
Without being flippant, I guess I will be flippant, you're basically watching an ocean liner that has perceived an iceberg on the horizon and is finally taking some measures to try to avoid crashing into it. The federal Leviathan, like an ocean liner, it can't be turned 90 degrees mid-ocean. But what I think the court might be doing is actually trying to apply some rudder to steer away from the disaster that we've been headed to for, I'd say, at least the last 90 years since the New Deal revolution. I'm sure you guys have seen Monty Python and the Holy Grail, one of my favorite movies. There's this wonderful scene where these giant knights, the Knights of Ni, give Arthur a task, which is to chop down the mightiest tree in the forest with
a herring.
A herring! Well, guess what? That's what's at issue in this new case, Loper Bright Enterprises, that the Supreme Court is going to hear in the fall. This is about herring fishing. The relevant agency, which in this case is the National Marine Fisheries Service, give yourself a bonus if you knew that one even existed, has decided that every boat in the Atlantic herring fishery has to have, at least for some part of the season, an inspector from the National Marine Fisheries Service on board. It costs about $700 a day, which represents about 20% of a profit margin of an average boat in the Atlantic herring fleet. The dispute is, who has to pay for that inspector? The people who operate the boat say, you want an inspector on my boat? You pay for it. The National Marine Fisheries Service says, nope, we're doing you a favor by putting an inspector on your boat because otherwise you wouldn't be allowed to go out, so you pay for it. And that's the issue that's going up to the Supreme Court. Two issues. First, who's right? And second, this is where it gets exciting, should the Chevron Doctrine be overruled finally?
What do you think the odds are?
Slightly better than even money. In a sane world, it would be 90%, but it's the Supreme Court, so best I can do is slightly better than even money.
But this batch of justices are willing to wade into waters that previous courts have been unwilling to even consider.
Yes. One thing that we might want to discuss and might not want to discuss is the fact that those waters are now at about a class 6 if this was a whitewater. There has been a great deal of controversy around the Supreme Court in the last couple of months, as I'm sure you are aware. And it's anybody's guess how that might or might not affect a case of this magnitude. You know, this would be like a 7 or an 8 on the jurisprudential Richter scale for the Supreme Court to say we are no longer going to defer to alphabet soup agencies, often enormously self-serving interpretations of their operating statutes. That would be a huge big deal. So your initial response to my description of the Chevron Doctrine was exactly right, James, as always. It's a preposterous giveaway of judicial power to agencies that not only are ill-equipped to exercise that power for perfectly obvious public choice reasons, but it's also unconstitutional for them to exercise that power because it is fundamentally the judicial power, and only the judiciary can exercise it. But it's also incredibly foolish. It's incredibly foolish to just say to a bunch of administrative bureaucrats, hey, man, whatever you think would be a good idea, just go for it.
Really, what we're dealing with here is Congress, as is so often the case, abrogating its responsibility, saying, we would love for this nonsense to happen. Executive branch, you're up. Make it so.
No, that's exactly right.
Absolving themselves of all responsibility of oversight. There's literally no oversight for any of this nonsense. They may claim there is, but there most certainly is not. And the Supreme Court comes along and says, okay, yeah, that sounds good.
Well, somewhat unusually for you, James, you've actually put the best face on it.
Yeah.
That's all that's going on, is that this is just basically people who can't be bothered handing it off. It's, of course, worse than that. A lot of what happens here is that there's a policy that one party wants to implement. They can't get the votes to get it through Congress. And so what they hope is we can just get our guy in the Oval Office long enough to ram it through and have the executive branch do the thing that we, as a legislative body, couldn't agree on. And a perfect example of that is from a case from last term. that you may have heard of, and I can't remember if it's been discussed on Words and Numbers, although I am a faithful listener. This was the West Virginia v. EPA case, and this involved an incredibly significant question about electric power generation in this country that Congress has been debating for years, and that is whether to push electric power generators to embrace renewable energy and move away from fossil fuels. It may be a good idea, it may be a bad idea. I'm not an expert, I don't know. I kind of suspect that maybe it's not a great idea because I am generally aware that renewables like solar and wind and hydro come with lots more problems than we're usually told when they're being pushed. But put that to one side. At a minimum, it's, one would think, obviously up to Congress whether to implement such a massive change in an industry of that size. And we know that they haven't. Why? Because they've been debating it for years. But first the Obama administration, and then there was a pause under Trump, and then the Biden administration picked up. They said, well, why should we wait for Congress to authorize us explicitly to do this? We'll just have the EPA order electric power generators to move to renewables. And when that was challenged, you better believe that the EPA said, hey, Chevron deference. Maybe it's not 100% clear whether this random statute from way back when, I think it was actually maybe the Clean Air Act from, whatever it was, 60 years ago, specifically authorizes us to do this, but it's at least ambiguous, and you have to defer to our interpretation of the statute. So that's the kind of incredibly momentous policies that agencies will try to shove through the door. And the Supreme Court has kind of a whimsical way of describing it. They call it hiding an elephant in a mouse hole. When an agency tries to ram through such a massive policy without express congressional authorization on the premise that some relatively generic statute that's been lying around for 50 or 60 years, oh my goodness, who knew? Our power to do this has always been hiding in this mouse hole for all those years.
And lucky for us, now we've just found it.
How often do agencies attempt that? And then how often, if at all, does the Supreme Court say, no, this is overreach?
Constantly and rarely. It reminds me of Hemingway on bankruptcy. How'd you go bankrupt? 2 ways. Slowly and then all at once.
This is why this is so fascinating right now, right? Because the Supreme Court just did something nobody could have ever predicted. They said, oh yeah, we're going to take a look at this Chevron nonsense and we'll get back to you. We all stopped dead in our tracks.
You know what I suspect might have been the proverbial straw on the camel's back? I mean, who knows? I'm just going to speculate here. It's why you have me on. Does anybody remember when a federal agency relatively recently decided that even though there was no express statutory authorization, that they were going to do about a $500 billion giveaway to a particular group of people?
You're talking about student loan forgiveness?
Yeah, I'm talking about student loan forgiveness. We like to say that's a Biden policy, but technically it was the Secretary of the Department of Education that had to make a finding that loan forgiveness was authorized by an existing federal statute. And they searched high and low until they finally settled on this ridiculous HEROES Act that was enacted back in the wake of the first Iraq War that was designed to give veterans a break on some of their student loan repayments. Oh, guess what? Actually, come to think of it, Congress meant not only veterans of the Iraq War, but everybody.
This is astounding.
Yeah, it is astounding. It is. But again, that is such a flagrant abuse of this power that I suspect that the Supreme Court, some of the justices might have said, you know what, it's time to take a rolled up newspaper across somebody's nose.
And look, from an administration right now that is apparently contemplating telling us all that they can just kind of wave their hand and make the debt ceiling disappear because ... the 14th Amendment.
Yeah, it makes me think of it's sort of a classic late 20th century plot device in a lot of books and movies where you've got maybe some kid whose parents aren't super functional. Perhaps they have some substance issues. Perhaps they have some relationship issues. They don't really have a lot of energy for parenting. And then the kid, of course, has to sort of grow up and start taking care of him or herself at the age of like 10 or 12. That's perhaps not a terrible analogy to the two houses of Congress. Totally dysfunctional, don't have a lot of time for governing. And so you got the executive branch going, well, I guess somebody's got to run the country because you guys aren't helping. As much as I feel like it's a very weird thing for me to feel some sympathy for power aggrandizing executive branch bureaucrats, but maybe not all of them are acting in bad faith. Maybe they're just looking over at Congress saying, hey, you know what? I'd love some guidance, but I'm obviously not going to get any, so I guess I got to figure out some way to keep this agency running. And I know I'm not going to really hear any meaningful input from you on how to do it, so I'm just going to figure out what I think would work best. But of course, it never plays out that way.
It's interesting you say that. I have a good friend who's a lawyer for and I can't recall what the actual name is, but it's whatever agency that handles importation of goods into the country. He said Congress enacted some regulation or tax or something on bicycles. And that was the extent of the law. And it was actually up to him, this particular individual, to say, yes, this thing that's coming into the country is or is not a bicycle. Therefore, the law does or does not apply to it.
Yeah.
I mean, look, who's being Pollyannish now? You guys are both putting the most positive spin on this that you possibly can. If you give a bunch of office twerps the ability to decide how the rest of us are going to live, they will do that to the fullest extent possible, because that's what people who want those kinds of jobs do.
I'll tell you a quick story, James. You don't need me to illustrate your point, but why not? It's a podcast. It's fun. There's a case in front of the Supreme Court now. It is, believe it or not, the third time this case has been to the Supreme Court. It's called Sackett versus Environmental Protection Agency. Sacketts are a family in, I think it's Idaho, that wanted to build a house. The EPA, Environmental Protection Agency, said, well, it's possible that the runoff from your house could go into a protected waterway, and so you might not be able to build your house. And that's a very ambiguous opinion to receive from a federal agency. And they essentially, the first time they said, well, is there some way we could actually find out whether it's okay? And they said, yeah, well, yeah, of course there is. The way you find out if it's okay is that you go ahead and build your house. Then we'll decide whether it was okay. And if it wasn't, we'll fine you something like $37,000 for every day after you started construction. And the response was what you might expect, like, are you kidding? That's the only way to find out. And EPA, without batting an eye, not only repeated and said to them, yeah, that's the only way to find out, repeated that in court. So when the Sackett family sued, the EPA literally went into court and said, that is our position. Their choices are, don't build the house, or build it and find out the hard way that our position is you shouldn't have built it. But we will not give you any further guidance of that. You have to expose yourself to $37,000 a day in fines to get a clear answer.
How is this to the Supreme Court price when it should have been at a lower court for about 8 seconds?
Right.
That's because the way that your savvy agency lawyer and your savvy DOJ appellate lawyer handles things is they make sure that you as a citizen are always playing whack-a-mole. So whatever claim it is that you're trying to advance, you don't have standing to advance that claim. And if you do have standing, the claim is not yet ripe for review. It's too early. And if it's not too early, then guess what? It's too late. So there's always some clever reason why you shouldn't be in court litigating that particular claim at this particular time. And they become extraordinarily adept at parsing out a case like this so that you have to get one answer at a time. The first question was, is it reasonable for an agency to tell us that the only way to find out if we can build our house is to build it and expose ourselves to $37,000 a day in fines? Supreme Court, nope, that's not reasonable. So then they go back. They apply for permission. Go up the second time. I'll have to look it up. I couldn't tell you what the second case was, but they're there a third time, and the third time is the waterway in question a water of the United States, or a WOTUS, as I'm sure you guys know, a WOTUS? Is it a WOTUS? And it's taken them 10 years to get an answer to that question, because you're not allowed to go and get an answer to your whole case. You don't get a question all at once from the courts. No, that would make too much sense. You get an answer one issue at a time.
Wow.
What you said earlier, that the Supreme Court is rolling up a newspaper looking for a nose. That is a stunningly beautiful way to look at this. Any idea when we might actually have some kind of answer?
I believe that the timing is such that I'll double check this as we're talking. I think this Loper-Bright case, this
might be that kind of case that waits till the very end of the decision. Right? We may get this one after a long, long list of things.
Oh, yes, but it will not be argued this year because the cert grant was on May 1st, which means that it won't be argued until the fall. The good news is it's probably going to be among the earlier cases argued. If I had to predict, I would say we get an answer, let's say February or so of next year.
I don't think people understand how profound a change this could be.
I've been remiss. I want to do something that I should have done a moment ago. Cato Institute, where I work, filed a really great amicus brief in the Loper-Bright cases. And I'm going to give credit to one of our legal associates who just graduated from law school. His name is Isaiah McKinney. He was the one who did the heavy lifting on this brief. And what he did was he spent weeks digging into an empirical question, which is there any inconsistency between the way the federal courts of appeals apply Chevron deference versus the way the Supreme Court has been applying it? And guess what he found? Massive difference. So the Supreme Court rarely applies Chevron deference anymore, and the lower appellate courts almost always do. So there's been a fork. The Supreme Court has been going off in one direction, and the lower courts of appeals have just completely ignored it. We put this in our amicus brief, and we showed the Supreme Court that, look, you as a court, even though you haven't weighed in kind of officially and said we're going in a different direction, you have been going in a different direction, and the lower courts have not picked up on it, and they are not following you. The time has come for you to just make official what you've already been doing, which is dialing Chevron deference way back. And you know what? Why not just get rid of it at this point? As I said, I think that the odds of the Supreme Court eliminating Chevron deference are slightly above 50%. This would be one of the most significant jurisprudential developments of the, let's say, last couple of generations, because so much of American governance, so much of who decides what you can or cannot do with your business, your home, the environment, etc., is decided not by democratically accountable, theoretically, legislators, but by appointed administrative agency bureaucrats. And to take away from them this gigantic font of power, which is what will happen if the Supreme Court eliminates Chevron deference, it is impossible to overstate the significance of that development. And there's better than a coin toss chance that that's going to happen within the year.
Is that the best case scenario?
Yeah, best case scenario is that Chevron deference is eliminated by the Supreme Court, and we get straight up, start from the 50-yard line judicial review of every decision that administrative agencies make with respect to the interpretation of their enabling statutes. That would be a sea change in the way things are done.
Governance shouldn't be a rubber stamp. There should be oversight. And if that turns out to be difficult, maybe we're governing too much.
I agree with you, James. I think it could be great. And I'll make you an offer. If you want to come to Washington, D.C. and sit in the argument, I'll see if I can get you VIP tickets. I think I got a decent shot. Just watching you turn 6 shades of red and then purple as you listen to the government trying to defend Chevron deference alone would be worth the price of admission.
If you can make that happen, I will absolutely make that happen. I can't wait to heckle at the level of the Supreme Court. You bring the bail money and we'll be all square.
And that's all the time we've got this week on Words and Numbers. Until next time, be sure to follow us on Twitter. Handles are in the show notes. Join Words and Numbers Backstage, the Facebook group where the conversation continues, and
send us email, wordsandnumberspodcast@gmail.com.
Until next week, try to be nice to one person who doesn't deserve it. Just one. And who knows, it may turn into a trend. Give it a shot. You might feel good about yourself.
You could say you tried.
You tried, that's right. Till next week, can't take it easy.
See you next week, James.